And so let's start with this question. How can we understand the dynamics of whiteness? And this is an important question that we must ask, and I'd argue that it is critical for white people to start asking themselves this question. Do you know how to articulate the dynamics of whiteness? And as I look at many of our white UX leaders and how they have approached and evangelized what it means to be human-centered, I think it's fair to say that most people do not. And in service of capitalism, I think that the foundation laid before us by many well-known UX leaders on what does it mean to be human-centered is a truncated understanding of what it means to be human-centered, and it was built on and evangelized without understanding whiteness. And so I'm trying to imagine a panel with a lot of well-known white UX leaders, trying to imagine them on a panel talking about whiteness and the ways that they have considered that in their approach to their craft and the evangelization of their different methodologies and their books and their podcasts and whatnot. I think similar to how corporate America has taught us how to understand the word ally and allyship, so have we with our relationship and understanding of human-centeredness and what does it look like to be human-centered. And it looks a lot like this. As long as you think you're a good person, as long as you think you are kind enough and good enough, you're human-centered. Don't worry about doing any of the work. You're human-centered because you think you're good and kind enough. And so today, I'd like to challenge that. I think probably around this time, some white folks, you might be feeling a little comfortable because I'm drawing attention to your whiteness. And that's good. Dare I say, healthy and helpful. It's the first step. Because when you ask most people of color about their experience about being black or indigenous or Asian or whatever it may be, we can recount that pretty quickly. Ask yourself, what's your experience being white? How would you be able to recount that? What would those stories look like? How much time would you pause and hesitate before you answered? And so I like to propose some of the following conclusions about the dynamic of whiteness. The first being that most white people are unaware of their biases, prejudices, and how they manifest into discriminatory behaviors. And while it's admirable that a lot of white people, especially in UX, see themselves as working towards inclusivity and equity, the self-perception of viewing oneself as an unbiased individual, incapable of having racist thoughts or feelings, is often a major barrier to taking responsibility for and admitting one's biases and prejudices. This is also why in the beginning I talked about how a lot of my racial trauma actually stems from white men and women who take pride in being progressive or liberal. It's hard to admit that they too can have racist thoughts and prejudices. And this commonly, the second thing is this, that they often discount or diminish the impact of chronically being exposed to ethnocentric monoculturalism, read white supremacy. In America specifically, when I think about history and what we're taught about history, it's very nice in terms of not talking about what racism actually is. I think it's why a lot of times people start to freak out when they hear racist or white supremacy because their mind goes to what school taught us. KKK, white hood, like you're proactively violent against black people, but that's not what white supremacy is. That's a small part, actually, of what white supremacy is. And white supremacy is when whiteness and the comfort of whiteness is always first of mind and prioritized. And so it's okay to admit that this difficult reality is real. Because of the society we live in, it is nearly impossible for white people not to inherit any racial biases or prejudices. I think we just kind of need to be more comfortable with the truth, because I think that will help us to actually move forward and have more honest conversations about this. And when you move and live and breathe in a culture, in a society that prioritizes whiteness, if you are white, you are being culturally conditioned to not notice your whiteness. When you move and live and breathe in a society that prioritizes whiteness, if you are not white, You are being culturally conditioned to not notice the ways that you prioritize whiteness. And it is this lack of awareness that can cause UX professionals, and at times this also includes non-white professionals, because of this cultural conditioning, to be unaware of how we are being exclusive of peoples, cultures, and experiences that don't align to our understanding of the norm through the lens of whiteness. And finally, white UX professionals need to commit to developing a non-racist identity and free themselves from being passive participants in this cultural conditioning. In the academic journal, the counseling psychologist J.A. Katz writes this article called The Socio-Political Nature of Counseling. And in this article, he basically unpacks how and why a lot of the approaches to counseling psychology have been built on and prioritized and favored whiteness. And I think that the observations in this article are 100% applicable to the UX profession, as Katz observes the following major barrier that often gets in the way of white people intentionally unpacking and investigating their worldview and their cultural identity. He says, because white culture is the dominant cultural norm in the US, it acts as an invisible veil that limits many people from seeing it as a cultural system. Often it is easier for many whites to identity and acknowledge the different cultures of minorities that accept their own racial identity. The difficulty of accepting such a view is that white culture is omnipresent, it's everywhere. It is so interwoven in the fabric of everyday living that whites cannot step outside and see their beliefs, values, and behaviors as creating a distinct cultural group. In other words, we should not be shocked at the level of caucasity and unintentional racism in the UX industry. We should not be shocked by the roaring silence from our white leaders on how they mitigate caucasity or their racial biases or prejudices. This is why. And this is where I can extend grace, but it's not where I can extend excuse for silence. It's not where I can extend the excuse for a lack of commitment to do better, to humble themselves, and to acknowledge the harm that has been done and that can be done in light of this. And I think for a lot of white people, there's this fear in saying or doing the wrong thing in conversations around race or racial justice. But what if the pain of saying and doing nothing was more painful than saying or doing the wrong thing? What if the pain of saying and doing nothing was more painful than saying or doing the wrong thing? It's important to know and obviously understand that no one is born wanting to be racist. But that doesn't negate the reality that white people benefit the most from racism and from having systems and experiences in society that prioritize their comfort and their presence, especially in UX. And so I share this with one hope that white people will not only begin to accept their whiteness as real, but that they'd also commit to tethering themselves to it in an anti-racist manner. The second question, that a commitment to understanding and mitigating caucasity to the best of our ability should cause us to ask this: what are the ways unchecked caucasity leads to harm within the UX community? What are the thoughts, actions, and feelings from white people that stem from bold instances of unchecked privilege and/or racism? And this is the point of the talk where I decided to change the direction of where I originally wanted to go. I've been sitting in this talk for the month of May. And for the record, if I knew May would be the trash fire month it's turned out to be, I would not have proposed this talk. And so I've been sitting preparing for this talk. I've been reflecting on my own experiences of racism in this industry. I've been going through my own collection of screenshots of racist tweets and private DMs. My mom was in HR, so she taught me to document everything, so I have folders. I'm going over my, talking to other friends and their experience of racism and prejudice in this industry, reflecting on a conversation I had with the, interesting enough, Don Norman and some of the racist and prejudice things I experienced from him. And in preparing for this talk, I realized something. I'm tired. I'm so tired. Tired of having to advocate for the care and dignity of myself and other minoritized and marginalized folks in the community, because the care and dignity that I'm advocating for was never meant to be proven, because it's always been inherent. When a community requires you to prove that you deserve dignity and perpetually share why people should care about honoring it, they are committing a collective act of violence. I think in order for us to really understand and see unchecked caucasity for what it is, we have to start talking about it differently. We have to start talking about it differently. We have to start talking about the impact that it actually has on people, including your colleagues, your peers, your friends. We have to recognize it for the harm and the violence that it actually is. You know what's wild about this talk is that a lot of you have been excited for this talk. And a lot of you have been okay with me giving this talk. Like, did anyone wonder, ask, was curious about how traumatic a talk like this could be for a presenter that has to actually recall moments of violence and racism and prejudice, not to the benefit of me or the satisfaction of me, but to the benefit and satisfaction of white people in the audience? Did anyone pause to think or ask that about this talk? Or was there just a little too much excitement towards it? And so I started to ask myself and sit with this. Why am I sharing my pain to the benefit of white attendees, but to the harm of me? To the harm of me. That's something we should sit in. Not just only with my talk, but other talks that touch this topic. Why? Why are we okay with that? Why are y'all excited about that?